We believe it's possible that Benin art and culture may have an origin going back to Ife, which would be useful in allowing us to extrapolate backward. By that I mean we have an understanding of the purpose of Benin art because it was created during the period of contact when Europe was coming into Africa and writing things down. So we have documentation that gives us a good idea of the manner in which artworks were created and also the way in which they were used. By taking that information, we might be able to safely assume that the pieces at Ife were used in a similar manner. Okay, the screens that I have up right now, 715 in O'Reilly, both of them, might give us a little bit of an in to understanding the way in which some of the artwork was actually used. These pieces are metal, brass or bronze. They are placed on an altar. The fact that they're metal is something that was restricted to the court. Metal, brass, bronze in particular, was considered to be durable and therefore permanent, but also shiny and reflective of wealth. It was a material that was respectful to use to depict your ancestors, and the heads on the altars, we believe, are divine ancestors. And the material itself reflects the permanence and continuity of the dynasty or of the family line. Okay, this is an altar where sacrifices were made. I think you can see some of the liquid that's poured down in the upper right in that particular photograph. There are also bells on the altar. Those bells were used to call attention of the ancestors so that when you're making an offering, the ancestors would be aware of it. The ivory tusks, again, a symbol of wealth. The tusks were under the control of the king, of the Benin king. So anytime a hunter killed an elephant, he had to give one first to the king and offer the second one to the king to purchase. Altars in Yoruba and in fact Benin, which continues, cultural area today, are still in use. And if you go to figure 718 in our textbook, you'll see an example that Mr. O'Reilly includes. So we have a fairly continuous line of tradition and a fairly good idea of the way in which these altars were actually used or practiced in the past. Let me return to the heads on these altars. We do believe, and we also believe that the Ife heads probably were used in a similar way. We believe that these heads are the depictions of divine ancestors. Okay. We would make offerings to these divine ancestors, royal ancestors, in order to maintain their goodwill and help in this world. What you're probably looking at here represent the heads of past kings of Benin, and they would be placed on an altar, and the current king would be making offerings to his ancestors to enlist their help. What we're talking about is animism, a belief in a life force that continues after death, and the ability of the spirit world to communicate with the living. Okay, this works a little bit like ancestor worship in China that we've already looked at, in particular in terms of the necessity to appeal to the ancestor and to flatter the ancestor, and certainly to make offerings to the ancestor. That is going to imply that the works of art also are going to represent idealism. This is 716 in our textbook, and it is a depiction of the Queen Mother. One of the things you might have noticed in my past slide is that there are 3 periods to Benin art: an early, a middle, and a late period. The works from the early period are the most valued by Western museums, based upon the thinness of the bronze and the delicacy of the casting and the original creation of the image using lost wax. These early images are the most naturalistic, and therefore collectors very early on were eager to acquire these, and museums also as well. This is one of the treasured early pieces, and it does depict a Benin Queen Mother, perhaps one of the most important of the Queen Mothers, Idia, who is historically significant and almost became a kind of legendary figure. To the Benin, however, it might in fact be the late works that are more valued and appreciated, because they were made with a larger quantity of bronze. They are more stylized, less naturalistic, but more heavily made, and showed a display of wealth. And we'll get a comparison later. This particular piece, we do think, represents ancestral veneration, okay, ancestor worship. It is the head of the Queen Mother, very refined, very sophisticated, very elegant. She would have been the highest female figure at court. She is wearing delicately crafted coral beads around her neck, and she's also donning a peaked headdress, which curves forward, echoing the thrust of her chin, giving us a kind of sweeping curve through the shape of the woman. The image is, I would suggest, not quite as naturalistic as Ife pieces. It is a little more generalized, and its aim instead is to create a kind of timeless image of royal authority. It does it with the expression on the face, but also with the symbols that go along with that face, and that would be the coral beads and the very, very carefully knitted beads that make up the headdress on top of the head of this woman. She is a very important figure in Benin history. Idia helped her son in time of war, and consequently he gave her the title of Queen Mother and gave her her own palace compound and court. So this is essentially explaining why things are the way they are. This is part of an origin story. This would have been created during a period when Benin was expanding its wealth through trade with the Portuguese. At the time of the death of this woman, Idia, her head that we're looking at right here would have been placed on her altar, and we would have begun to leave sacrifices to her to ensure that her spirit, her life force, would continue to assist us in the world of the living. This is a detail. Again, you can see the delicacy, the elegance of this piece. You can see the network of beads that make up the headdress of this woman. You can also see the scarification patterns that appear where I guess her eyebrows should be. And there are also iron inserts between the scarification lines. And if you look at the pupils of her eyes equally, those are inserts in iron. And in this case, I think it is a reference to her power and to her strength. She was a particularly determined and strong woman, the kind of queen in the royal line whose life force you would hope would continue to support you in the next world. A word about the scarification on Idia's face. Scarification patterns are also referred to as ethnic markings. They help to identify us with a group, so there is group cohesion, a sense of belonging, a sense of oneness. They also can be used for purposes of status. Certainly at the time of the Benin court, they would have been used as status symbols. The slide that I have on the screen right now consists of 4 pictures that I found on the web about 2 years ago, just to give you a sense of what the scarification patterns or ethnic markings might actually look like. The top 2 are similar in nature, particularly one top right, to the markings that we find on the face of Idia. The bottom 2, however, have thinner, more delicately crafted lines running across the face of the individuals. And these I honestly didn't think possible, but here they are. And let me just take us with that in mind to this again. This is the Ife head, and I'd like you to see the lines running over the face. We do in fact believe that those are scarification patterns. We also tend to believe that these heads may indeed have been used the same way as the Benin heads were used, and that is to show respect for the ancestral spirit, perhaps even providing a reservoir for the ancestral spirit to dwell in. The images that I have on the screen right now are brass roosters. These were placed on the altar of the Queen Mother. You can see some of these I think the Met has some, but I know that Penn Museum has some. So I am aware that you can actually get to see some of these. What they do is represent sacrificial offerings. So they represent the chicken that might be sacrificed during the ritual to honor the ancestors. They are also male, and in that sense they acknowledge the special powers that were held by the Queen Mother. She has almost a kind of male authority, certainly in her own court and in her own compound. The roosters also, though, are simply just beautifully made. They're beautifully and elegantly patterned and textured, even with scales running down the legs of the rooster. The roosters at Penn and at the Met were collected in 1897 by the British during a punitive raid that I'm going to be talking about shortly. Hey, this is another view. I guess you could say I like the rooster. This is another view of our rooster, and what I'd like you to see is the patterning. I'd also like you to see the robust quality of the object and the fact that, yes, it's stylized, but it also has the reflection of naturalism, and it certainly reveals careful observation of the subject. Between the legs of our rooster, and he does have spurs on his legs, so we know he's a male, there is a little indentation in the base, and that would have been used for the living to place an offering on the altar. It could have been koala nuts, it could have been something else, but the idea of making the offering to appease the ancestor, to satisfy and show respect for the ancestor, was a particularly important part of the use of these objects. Okay. This is just to show you the contrast between early and late Benin work. The one that's on the right is a head. It is a bit more naturalistic, a bit more delicate, let's say reserved. And in particular, if you take a look at the coral bead necklaces, a little bit less indulgent in terms of the quantity. The bronze itself would be thinner, and the overall appearance would be more lifelike. The one that's on the left is a later piece, much more bronze in the casting. We're starting to lose naturalism, and the artist is becoming obsessed with showing details associated with wealth and status or rank. And that's going to be true for the coral beads that are coming up now to the line of the lip. This is 717 in our textbook, and it is a belt mask. There are two of these, one located in the British Museum, and that's the one O'Reilly's given us, and another located in the United States. They were cut from the same piece of ivory, and I'm trying to find, I've got New York City, so I'm going to say probably in the Met, but I am not certain. Cut from the same piece of ivory, and again we think this is Idea, this very, very special Queen Mother, and we think that the king or the Oba would have worn this during rituals to show respect and to commemorate his mother. Ivory, like brass, was restricted to the royals. This is a small piece. It's coming in a little under 10 inches. And it is generally described as a belt mask, so it could be worn during ritual performances on the belt of the performer, the dancer in particular. The face of Idea is a face. This is a closer look. Okay. As we get a closer view of Idea's face, we can see that it's very calm, it's very controlled, it's very commanding. In other words, it is an example of ideal naturalism again, and a reference to the idea of the cool, we believe. Her face is also surrounded by stylized images, alternating or juxtaposed images of mudfish with Portuguese sailors or soldiers. The mudfish is a symbol of the god of the sea, Alokan, who is associated with wealth and with fertility because you gain so much to eat and to trade from the sea. The dual nature of the mudfish, that it is a fish that lives in water and on land, is also a parallel to the king, who is known to be both human and divine. So the mudfish is a perfectly appropriate symbol to put on the head of the Queen Mother. It references her son, but it also references wealth and good fortune. Between the mudfish, let's take a closer look yet. Okay, here you can maybe see a little more clearly. Between the mudfish, there are images of Portuguese soldiers or sailors, and you might be wondering, okay, what are they doing there? Well, we think that the Portuguese also referenced ideas of wealth because they came across the sea in very powerful vessels, but they also traded with Benin, and by doing so, they brought wealth to the kingdom of Benin. This particular image is a highly respected, revered image, very sensitively carved, conveying ideal naturalism. And again, showing us those metal inserts between the eyes of the great Queen Mother. The Benin court was incredibly rich. We have descriptions from the Portuguese and others who actually had the opportunity to come and trade with Benin. They describe the royal processions with the king appearing in public wearing leopard skins, riding a horse with all of his attendants, great pomp, great circumstance. When you entered the palace compound, there were also brass or bronze carvings, castings of great pythons. The python is the king of snakes, an appropriate metaphor, essentially, for the king himself. So when you go through the doorway, it becomes essentially an entrance to the world of the divine. It would also be inside the palace that the altars to past kings and queens would be placed. The head of the python, which is located on the right, is located in the Pennsylvania Museum, Penn Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The work that's on the left, I don't think Penn has this. They have similar examples. This is a depiction of the king as a mudfish. He's morphing into a mudfish. His legs become mudfish, reminding us that the two had parallel personalities, being able to bridge two realities. We also see, however, that the king has two attendants supporting him. And this is a reminder that the king himself, who is a bridge to the divine, requires the support of everyone in his court. We need to do that. We need to support the king, because it's only in that way that the king can help us continuing to get the support from the world of the spirits and the world of the ancestors. Okay, both of the objects that we are looking at now were acquired in a punitive expedition of 1897 that was undertaken by the British, that I'm going to talk about in our next talkie.